Previously on JM on Cars.
Now, I seem to be in a bit of a minority here, and I'll have to apologise for being a bit distracted because I've just passed a Vauxhall Omega parked up on the side of the road. When's the last time you saw one of those about? Well, this is a real blast from the past. Today I am driving a 1999 Vauxhall Omega. In its day, a pretty serious saloon car, but now almost entirely forgotten and a real rarity. But a quarter of a century after it rolled out the factory gates in Germany, what is it like on the roads of Britain? Vauxhalls are funny old things, and I think for most people, either it's a brand that you're really into, or you're not. For some, it's a family affair, and if you have a Vauxhall, that's because your mum had a Vauxhall, your dad had a Vauxhall, your brother has a Vauxhall, and if ever you dare turn up with a Ford, you shall instantly be disowned. And then for your neighbours across the street, the exact opposite is true. In recent years, and for some of my younger viewers, I think the cars they're most likely to be familiar with and perhaps have an affinity for are the likes of the Corsa and Astra VXR, perennial alternatives to the likes of the Fiesta and Focus ST. However, not all that long ago, Vauxhall was a car brand you would consider if you wanted to buy something a little fancier too. And this Omega is really the last in that line. The very last time that Vauxhall really tried to take the fight to BMW and the 5 Series. And as you might imagine, it didn't go all that well. However, time is a great healer, and so today I am delighted to be able to drive this utterly gorgeous example of a facelifted B2 Vauxhall Omega, courtesy of its very lovely owner, Phil. And I did mention earlier that this is often a family affair. Well, that has never been more true than for this particular car, because it was built in 1999, registered later in the middle of 2000, and then about 6 months into its life, bought by Phil's father, who was a bit of a Vauxhall man, always believing they were slightly better built than their Ford counterparts. He'd had a then new Vectra and did like it, but he really wanted the Omega. This was the car that sat above. It was the executive saloon offering, equivalent really to a BMW 5 Series, and of the day also the likes of a Rover 800. Now, apparently Phil's mum wasn't quite so keen on the idea. This is still a relatively large car at 4.8 metres long, and she was fairly certain that she wouldn't be able to park it with any degree of success. So, heeding her words and then ignoring them, Phil's dad went out, bought it anyway, had parking sensors fitted by the dealer, and then said, "Here, this is our car." He drove it for the next sort of 6 or 7 years and then decided he wanted to part with it. But Phil didn't want that to happen, so he said, "Dad, I want to buy the car." But his dad said, No, son, I don't think you can afford to run it." But he said, "No, I'm not letting it go. I really like it. I want it." And he offered more than the dealer was offering as Part X. And so Dad relented and said, "Fine, here, take it." In the end, no money was actually exchanged, which warms my heart because it means he was a proper dad. And even better, Phil, true to his word, has looked after the car, and even though it is now displaying 153,000 miles on the clock, it looks utterly glorious. This British racing green paintwork gleams in the sunlight, and though the shape is really a little bit weird, it's equal parts retro but also somewhat futuristic, in that same mould as a Ford Taurus now looks. It's just interesting. I like looking at it. It's really old school and a bit cool for it. Inside is very much the same. It's this weird mix of kind of 80s, 90s and noughties. The dials here, they look actually relatively modern. You could see those being in a car from the mid-2000s. Here, the centre console looks very much like you'd have got in the Vectra of the 2000s. But then above it, you have the little dot matrix readout, same as you would have got in, say, an Astra of the 90s. And these air vents feel, well, practically 1980s, as do many of the controls here for the lights and the window switches and the like. There's a weird mixture of really hard edges and squared off pieces, then more round, curvaceous elements. It almost feels a bit like a prototype car, like something halfway through a metamorphosis. But I think at least partly for that, it is really rather charming. This is a CD trim level, which is one apparently from the bottom. There were, I think, about 3 others above it, including the range-topping MV6, and they would have got you things like a nicer leather interior, so on and so forth. But even this is actually quite well equipped. You've got electric windows all round, you've got dual zone climate control, heated seats, and remember people, this is the 1990s we're talking about. Things like electric windows were definitely considered an option, as were things like power steering, ABS, traction control, which was introduced for the facelift. And the fact that this has got not just air conditioning, but climate control, well, that's really, really fancy. You could even have in these a sat-nav, which would have gone up here, and I presume with it would have come a nice full colour screen rather than the dot matrix one. I'd actually quite like to see a dot matrix sat-nav, that would be adorable. These stalks are quite familiar to anybody that's ever driven a Lotus Elise or Exige. The wheel itself is a slightly odd shape as well. You've even got some controls for the stereo on it, and these seats are really quite old school. As is the smell in this thing. It smells like 90s Vauxhall in here. Takes me back. Nobody in my family, I think, had an Omega. That would have been far, far too aspirational. My granddad did have a Cavalier though, sort of early 90s one, and I was never really fond of that car because by the early noughties, when he had it, it was an old man's car and I was not keen on it at all. I've actually in recent years driven a few of the Vectras which replaced the Cavalier, and actually pretty fine cars. And compared to those, you can tell that this is both more upmarket but also a little bit older. It's a really, really weird crossover, this thing. I must say, the sun has come out, it's really rather warm. I can see I'm quite silhouetted in some of these shots, but still, the aircon is doing a very nice job. Actually, I've even twigged, this has a CD player in it. Not a cassette, because in the day you'd probably get a cassette and there may be a CD changer as an option, but no. This is CD player, front and centre. That was swish. The only bit of this thus far that I'm really not getting on with is the seats. I know the idea of fabric is that they're supposed to be more breathable than leather, you know, cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, but, well, whatever they made these ones out of, it's just really, really itchy. It's a bit weird, and my back's getting a little bit sweaty, information I'm sure that you don't want. And yeah, I'd rather the leather ones, I think. You're safer with those. As is often the case with these older cars, visibility is absolutely excellent. The pillars are all fairly thin, the B pillars nice and far back, there's loads of glass, the belt line is fairly low. You can see basically everything. It's pretty comfy too. I feel a little bit close to the wheel. This feels like the right place for me to be, but I'm just a little further forward than I'd want to be. Not that the seat can't be adjusted. Although one thing you do feel with this car is, despite the fact it is still fairly large, it actually feels quite compact in here. There's plenty of legroom for passengers in the back. You could happily get 4 or maybe 5 adults in here, depending on their size, and the boot is enormous. It's really uniform in size too, and this would make an excellent load lugger, airport car, or the like. In fact, if you are the sort of person that wants a classic daily, I think this would make a really, really good choice. It even, I'm told, on a run, will do in excess of 40 to the gallon. Though, when pressed about that, because I don't know about you, but that sounds suspect out of an old 2.5 litre naturally aspirated V6 with a 4-speed slushy box, Phil did tell me that that is when driven like an old man with 11.5 points on his licence who is being followed by a traffic copper. So, yeah, do with that information what you will. Other things about this car that are noteworthy. It comes from that era where, though they did offer a diesel, it wasn't the common option. There was a range of both 4 and 6-cylinder petrols, including this, the 2.5 litre, which wasn't the top of the line. That was the 3 litre, later the 3.2. And this particular car actually is very much an oddball because it is a crossover model. If you were to look at the Wikipedia page for these, you would think, naturally, that the engines were changed when the cars were facelifted. But actually, the two were slightly out of sync. So there's a very, very short period where this 2.5 went into a facelift car, as we have here, before it then became the 2.6. And I think the same goes for the 3 litre, which became the 3.2. The easiest way to identify the facelift is by looking at the grille. If, like this, it is integrated into the bonnet, then it is the later B2. However, if it's separate, then it's the early car. This one, as was normal for the day, is naturally aspirated and makes 170 horsepower. Torque is 163 pounds-feet. Though the chassis was brand new, it was still somewhat old school in that it drove only the rear wheels. At this point in time, some other manufacturers were changing even their higher-end cars from rear to front-wheel drive in the name of all sorts of different reasons, chiefly cost and packaging. And as it happens, even the name of this car is actually a little bit confusing. The only really consistent thing about Vauxhall and Opel is their inconsistency. So, though in Britain this is the one and only generation of the Omega, having been introduced in 1994 and retired in 2004, it is actually the second generation elsewhere. The first generation here was called the Carlton. And if you're a petrol head, you'll almost certainly know that name attached to the Lotus Carlton, which I have driven, and is a bit of a weird car that I would quite like to revisit. There was sadly no equivalent for this generation. Instead, you just got the range-topping 3 and 3.2 litre with about 210 and 218 horsepower respectively, but even this actually feels okay. And it sounds quite a bit more impressive than you might expect. In fact, when I first got into it and we went off to go and do the drive-bys, I thought that there was an exhaust blow or something like that, but I am told, no, one of the cats has been changed, but otherwise it is, well, standard and glorious for it. The suspension is nice and plush, the wheels aren't exactly gargantuan by today's standards. Happily, most of the parts you can still get for these, and keeping one on the road, if it's in fine fettle, shouldn't be too much of an issue. So, if you have kept one on the road, what then is it like to drive when you want to have some fun? Let's turn it round and find out. What's the turning circle like? Here we go. It's rear-wheel drive, so it should be decent, and it is. Oh, yes. Okay, and yep, right. Automatic, there is a sport mode. Yep, we're in that. Let's go. Oh, listen to that rasp. I mean, it'll do it, but that is not its natural way. Trying to persuade the gearbox to do what you want is a bit of effort, but in all honesty, even if this did have a manual, yes, that would improve things slightly, but then you realise that the chassis just, well, it doesn't want to be hustled. Once you're in a bend and the car's adopted its stance, that's sort of it. You have to do a lot to try and persuade it to deviate from its course. The brakes do work, but they need a little bit of shove. Discs all round happily. Hey, there we go. Well, she does move. I'll give her credit for that. Trying to find a weight figure for this was actually quite difficult. It's somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 tons, so I'm going to say like 1.6. The diesels probably were the heavier ones. Oh, and on that front, one thing apparently notable about this generation of Omega is that out went the in-house diesel and in came a new 6-cylinder provided by BMW. Although today, who on earth would want a 30-year-old oil burner? No point at all. Especially when you can have this. Lovely. In fact, I'm sure somebody's going to hate me for saying this, Bit of a Busso-like rasp, this. And you know what? I really quite like this. It's really, really charming. Now, I'd never buy one because, though I have a bit of nostalgia for old Vauxhalls, what I really mean is Vauxhall Astra vans of the 1990s. Nostalgia is a funny thing like that. I never knew anybody that had an Omega, so I sort of forgot that the model even existed. A Cavalier was something that I knew a little bit more about, and frankly, I knew nearly nothing about those. However, this, to Phil, is more than just a car. It's memories. It's memories of his dad. It's memories of trips away, places. I love that. I really, really love that. Today I have driven a Ferrari GTC4 Lusso, an S700 horsepower, 200 mile an hour V12, a Fiat Multipla, the weird oddball thing from the late 1990s that is widely regarded as the ugliest car ever made, and this. They're all wonderful in their own weird ways, but this is the one that I was most looking forward to driving. And it's not really what I expected, but then I guess I don't know what I expected, so that's helpful, isn't it? Naughty journalist, know what to expect before you get in the car. Anyway, I want to say a huge thank you to Phil for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.